Wonderful. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear colleagues from wherever you join us. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here to an important discussion we are going to have on financial integrity. Let me first thank the UNODC for allocating this slot to us during the high-level week here. Let me also thank Liechtenstein for yet another good example of collaboration. And of course, the co-sponsors to this event, Spain, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Australia. Warm welcome also to the panelists here in the room that my colleague Dr. Leona Von will introduce to you in a second. Dear colleagues, financial inclusion is the delivery of financial services at affordable cost, especially to vulnerable populations. Access to financial services contributes to human and economic development, and financial inclusion also reduces vulnerabilities. There are still 1.7 billion adults worldwide that do not have a basic transaction account. De-risking and financial exclusion remain challenges for many sectors, and they run contrary to the risk-based approach as promoted by the Financial Action Task Force. Also, survivors often find that traffickers have hijacked their financial identity for money laundering purposes, spoiling their creditworthiness and complicating financial reintegration. We are working with major banks and survivor services organizations, and we have managed to reintegrate over 2,000 survivors into the formal financial system. Launched in the United States, in the UK, and in Canada, coverage will now expand to other jurisdictions, and you will hear more on this soon. Let me just come up with a few housekeeping points for this session. We will have translation into Spanish. You just have to use the translate button here in Zoom. You can submit questions using the Q&A facility, and the session is going to be recorded. Let me now move over and pass on the floor for introductory remarks to Her Excellency Dominik Hasler, the Foreign Minister of Liechtenstein.
Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to be with you today for this important side event on the margins of the high-level meeting on the global plan of action on trafficking in person. My deep appreciation goes out to the co-sponsors for joining us in organizing this event on financial inclusion as a way to prevent human trafficking and modern slavery. Human trafficking and modern slavery are crimes that thrive in conditions of increased vulnerability. Vulnerability which the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated. To quote the UN Special Rapporteur on this issue, the severe socio-economic effect of the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to increase the scourge of modern-day slavery, already impacting over 40 million people before the global pandemic. The ripple effects of the COVID-19 pandemic will necessitate greater effort and engagement in the fight to end modern slavery and human trafficking for many different reasons. First and foremost, populations that are already marginalized, discriminated against, and impoverished will be at greater risk of exploitation because of additional obstacles to adequate health care, further constraints on their movement, and increased stigmatization and discrimination. Vulnerability to modern slavery and human trafficking will increase because of the pandemic's amplification of their drivers, including growing poverty and economic inequality. Meanwhile, women and girls who are already disproportionately affected by trafficking and modern slavery will find themselves even more vulnerable as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, as many are forced to drop out of school early and sent to work in exploitative conditions, or are married off against their will. And widespread school closures in response to the threat of COVID-19 render school-aged girls more susceptible to exploitation. The COVID-19 pandemic is therefore a call on all of our societies to do our part to build back better, including redoubling our efforts to end trafficking and modern slavery. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, part of our efforts to build back better from the pandemic should include work to build resilience against these crimes, with the goal of their elimination. Human trafficking and modern slavery are not only an assault on human dignity, but also at disturbingly profitable forms of organized crime, generating billions of US dollars in revenue each year. The financial sector must therefore play a key role in their eradication. For this reason, one of our approaches to fighting such crimes has often been to follow the money. That can not only lead us to the perpetrators, but also deny them the resources they need to commit these crimes in the first place. And focusing on other areas can be a game changer. In particular, greater financial inclusion is critical. To this end, and together with Australia, the Netherlands, the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, as well as United Nations University Center for Policy Research, Liechtenstein established the Financed Against Slavery and Trafficking Initiative, in short, FAST. FAST aims to engage the financial sector to tackle trafficking and slavery. I am particularly proud of FAST's Survivor Inclusion Initiative, which brings together a dedicated coalition of survivor support organizations, financial institutions, and other groups to facilitate survivor access to basic financial services and literature aimed at helping survivors' financial recovery to become full financial participants in their communities. I look forward to a rich discussion at today's event about how projects like the Survivor Inclusion Initiative promoting financial inclusion can help prevent human trafficking and modern slavery. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Hasler. I'm so excited about hearing more on the topic that I forgot to introduce myself. So my name is Daniel Telesgraf. I'm the Project Director of the FAST Initiative. Having done that duly, it's my pleasure now to hand over to the moderator for this session, Dr. Leona Vaughan, our Vulnerable Populations Lead. Leona, all yours.
Many thanks, Daniel. Welcome, everyone. So yes, my name's Leona Vaughan. I'm the Vulnerable Populations Lead for the Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking Initiative. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you all as participants and also to our incredible panel members. We have Mr. Ronnie Marty, Ms. Dawn Spicer, Mr. Carlos Andres Perez, and Dr. Isabella Chase, who are joining us today. All of our panelists come from a fantastically diverse range of experience and expertise and views on financial inclusion as a way to prevent modern slavery and human trafficking. So my work includes the Survivor Inclusion Initiative within FAST. And as Daniel mentioned, this initiative, which began in the UK, the US and Canada, and has integrated over 2,000 survivors back into financial life, is now being discussed in terms of how it expands into the region of Latin America and the Caribbean, but very much from a perspective of being needs-led rather than just automatic expansion. And that is the way that we work within this team. So back to our panelists. Ronnie is a certified public accountant, hospitality manager, independent human trafficking consultant, public speaker, and anti-trafficking advocate. He is a member of the International Survivor of Trafficking Advisory Council, a former member of the US Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, and where he served for 2 terms. Carlos is a lawyer with postgraduate studies on criminal law and a master's degree in international law and human rights. Between 2008 and 2018, he was the project coordinator against trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants at the UN Office of Drugs and Crime in Colombia. Before joining the United Nations, Carlos served for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Colombia, and 3 years ago, he joined the Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling section of UNODC at the headquarters in Vienna, from where he is responsible for accompanying the implementation of projects against trafficking in persons and migrant smuggling within 11 field offices in Latin America and the Caribbean. Dawn joins us as the Executive Director of the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force and an attorney by profession, with 29 years experience in the area of anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing and counter-proliferation financing. From August 2018 to August 2019, Ms. Spicer was appointed as Commissioner for the Liechtenstein Initiative, which was the financial sector commission addressing the issue of modern slavery and human trafficking. The initiative which led to the formulation of FAST as it exists now. Ms. Spicer is currently a member of the Effectiveness Expert Working Group of the Global Coalition for Fighting Financial Crime and the Caribbean Initiative Financial Inclusion Task Force. And last but not least is Isabella. Isabella is a research fellow at the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI. At the CFCS, Isabella leads a research cluster on financial crime futures, which assesses the role of technology and compliance, evolving anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing policy frameworks, and how inclusive financial integrity can be achieved. Her other research interests include new payment technologies, e-money, sanctions, and financial crime involving high-value goods such as art. So you can see we have an incredible lineup. So let's begin the conversation. Participants, please do place any questions that you have in the question and answer box during the discussion, and we will return to these at the end of the panel. So my first question to the panel is, in what ways do you think financial inclusion, and that's access to common financial services, can decrease the risk of human trafficking? And how does this differ in geographical contexts which you work in? So I open that to the panel.
I would like to start with that. And thank you first for inviting me. It's an honor. Thank you so very much. And so that's been a really difficult time for all population, not only the survivors of trafficking, for everybody, but in a way that they can really, the inclusion and access to common services is the first things. The financial institution they have to train the employees properly to know what is human trafficking, so the employees be aware how to identify like illegal transaction or potential victims of human trafficking. Is one of the first things that can do to decrease actually human trafficking. It's one of the things that they can do, but only to identify. Once it's identified, how to report, to respond to that, so that will actually to decrease the risk of any situation of human trafficking. And of course, I believe that from survival perspective, just to be more flexible in working with NGOs and the governments. NGOs are actually entities, we can say, that are working with a lot of survivors who experience, being trafficked and went through all those issues about money laundering and all the stuff with the traffickers. So they have the experience, and they have the data knowledge that they can provide to the financial institution together with governments and the NGOs. So if they can provide that information from the survivor, that can actually help to create like let's say a protocol or system that they can put in place to actually fight human trafficking from the financial point of view. So it's not only gonna help survivors of the society, but it's also gonna help the financial institution, because me as a financial institution, I don't want to lose money. And you know that trafficking is everything about money. So I think it's the first things is that the employees, they need to be well trained on human trafficking and how to respond to that and identify those red flags in order to really help on that. And of course, to prevent those illegal transactions. And with the information that survivors can provide based on the experience that we had, I think that's going to be a plus. Thank you.
Thanks, Ronnie. You touch on some really important aspects there in terms of training for accurate identification of slavery and trafficking, but also thinking about how we include survivors within gathering information to be able to anticipate and prevent. Carlos, would you like to come in there?
Yes, thank you for the invitation to UNODC to be part in this panel. I would like to share with you some reflections around the context of UNODC's work in Latin America and the Caribbean, and how we concluded some findings around the questions raised. As you know, UNODC was mandated to produce a global report on trafficking in persons every 2 years. And according with the latest version published on February 2020, in Latin America, we found some significant sub-regional differences. For example, in North America, Central America, and the Caribbean, most of the detected victims are girls, women, representing 79% of the total detected cases in this sub-region. But in particularly, the share of girls as a proportion of the total detected victims is 40%, which remains among the largest percentage of girls victims of trafficking recorded worldwide. On the other hand, in South America, most of the detected victims of trafficking are adult women, making up 69% of the total number of victims. In both regions, about 60% of the cases are for sexual exploitation, which also give us an understanding of the modus operandi used by traffickers in this region and how they are targeting some specific population. As you know, under the global program of trafficking in person, UNODC have developed some initiatives in coordination with field offices in Latin America and the Caribbean. One of them is an initiative that we call Track for Tip, which allow UNODC to monitor the criminal justice responses to trafficking situation within the migration flows. In South America and the Caribbean, we collected some information through that initiative that also reflected how financial component on an investigation for human trafficking is not an element widely incorporated by authorities in the region. Some of them express the lack of evidence for financial investigation or challenges in coordinating with other relevant stakeholders, especially during transnational investigation. And also it's a challenge communication with other sectors, such as the financial one. Last year, as part of a UNODC initiative of a compendium to promote cooperation between the public and private sector to counter trafficking in person in Latin America, we implemented a regional expert group meeting in December 2020. And it was clear that among the participants that one of the challenges in the region is the use of informal economies, such as cash transactions around trafficking in person for sexual exploitation. So for UNODC, one of the main points here is coordination between law enforcement agency and also specialized prosecutors, which is one of the key elements and the key points that UNODC is working in Latin America and the Caribbean. We are supporting one network of specialized prosecutors, which is the Red Tram network, which is composed by 21 specialized prosecutors. And last year, during an operation, there was an emblematic case between Panama and Colombia, which was named Cucuta case. In that case, it was evident the use of money transfer between traffickers in both countries as an element that's still being analyzed by law enforcement and agencies and prosecutors within this network. As part of the compendium that UNODC implemented, UNODC recommended that incorporating financial investigation is key to address human trafficking and also decrease the level of risk taken by potential perpetrators. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Dawn, would you like to come in on that point around investigation?
Yes, investigations is very important, and just what I wanted to tie back with that is the importance of financial inclusion, because again, it makes financial services accessible to all, and therefore decreases reliance on an informal or an illicit financial channels. And in doing so, you also have the element of financial inclusion that allows for know your customer. And knowing your customer by its very nature means that financial institutions get an opportunity to mitigate or diffuse or disrupt human trafficking, because they actually have to get information, integrate, and at that point in time, they can see some of the challenges that people may have. So if somebody comes before a bank teller and they notice this person is always accompanied, they can't hand over their identification documents themselves. The person who is with them basically reaches over and, you know, when the documents are being handed back, and they take the documents. So it's important to have these triggers from a financial institution perspective that can then be reported to financial intelligence units and other competent authorities and feed into investigations. So I see it as all being very connected in terms of how increased financial inclusion can also, you know, go all the way down in terms of diminishing the risk and where the risk exists in terms of disrupting what is there. Just to add quickly, from the Caribbean region point of view, the Global Findex database showed that financial inclusion mechanisms were developing slowly, more slowly in the Caribbean region, with 58% of adults being banked at financial institutions. So this is less than the global average, which is right now 63% for developing countries. And for developed countries, there's even a bigger gap, with developing countries at 94%. So it also showed that women are 6% more likely to have their own bank account, which is still 3% less than the global average. And that issues that promoted the financial exclusion include, you know, remote populations, poverty levels, obstacles in the financial system, such as enhanced due diligence, as opposed to using simplified due diligence for these types of populations, and the high cost of financial transactions. So this is just to give a flavor of what it is in a region where we can see that financial inclusion being at the lower level of use in the Caribbean means that it fosters or it creates a greater risk, especially as we will talk about later with COVID-19 and the risk of migration and the economic fallout that is happening as a result. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dawn. I think that that's an important aspect to remember as well, you know, sort of the interdependence, the correlation between the lower financial inclusion, that the greater the risk is for human trafficking and modern slavery. Isabella, did you want to add?
My comments would just be echoing those of my fellow panelists. So if you want to move on to the next question, that is more than all right by me.
Okay, great, thank you. So we will move on to the next question, which is around the pandemic and the impact. So how do you think that the pandemic has impacted on the levels of financial exclusion? And how does that in turn then increase or decrease vulnerability to trafficking for some populations? Who'd like to take that first? Dawn, shall I come to you because you mentioned the pandemic, or Isabella?
I can very quickly, because I think it'd be interesting, I can leave perhaps my other panelists to speak more about the impacts on vulnerable populations, but I think it's quite important to consider the impact on financial institutions themselves as the gatekeepers to finance, and then what that means for exclusion and inclusion. And I think we see a very sort of continuing to evolve trend here. So of course, you know, in the first year or so of the pandemic, with all the uncertainty, we did see an increase in de-risking for financial institutions. As we all know, with uncertainty, banks tend to readjust their risk appetites away from being inclusive. And that leads, especially in sort of the global south regions, we tend to see that a real increase in de-risking there. And of course, as Dawn already mentioned, one of the key things we all saw around the world, both in the first few months, but then continuing now, was the closure of bank branches, which, as Dawn said, has a huge impact on a bank's ability to detect human trafficking at the point of onboarding or ongoing parts of the bank life cycle. So I think as you had those closures in face-to-face elements of financial services, we saw big impacts on both inclusion, opening accounts, but also the vulnerability to human trafficking. I think less so now, but also initially in the first few months of the pandemic, we did see some impacts on financial intelligence units, which are the parts of banks and countries that are there identifying typologies and analyzing data. And much like all of us, individuals who worked in those units had disruptions to their lives. There was disruption to reporting. And I think in years to come, we'll learn a little bit more about what the impacts that had on investigations. But of course, conversely, I think it's important to think about not just the negative impacts of the pandemic on inclusion, but also some of the positives. I mean, we've seen a rapid acceleration in the trend towards digitizing payments. And as we've said, that with non-face-to-face onboarding can have risks, but it can also have massive positives for inclusion as we reduce costs and are able to be more inclusive. And of course, in the Latin American and Caribbean regions, we saw some of the highest levels of digital account opening during the pandemic that we saw anywhere in the world. So I think it's probably too early to say from a financial institution standpoint, but I would hope that the negative impacts and the short-term impacts on exclusion are outweighed by the long-term benefits of digital inclusion that we have seen accelerated by the pandemic.
I would like to add. Thank you. And again, that's what I've been dealing, because I work with a lot of survivors of human trafficking and all the things that we went through actually with the pandemic, starting with no jobs and no sources to actually get income to support their families. And it actually increases the chances the trafficking they have to recruit vulnerable people, because you were unemployed, or you were behind on your payments, or you are behind on your rent, or you have a mortgage. And a lot of people, they became homeless because there was not that support at the beginning of the pandemic, of course. And it's something that we really thank to the financial institutions and the government, that they provide some kind of help and for the whole community. So like forgiving of the loans or rents or something like that. Well, for the first 3 months, it helped a lot. But after that, it started being worse and worse. And so traffickers, they have more opportunity because of lack of opportunities for, let's say, for the society or for the survivors, the regular people actually, to get a job. There was no way for survivors to actually survive to what was happening with the pandemic. So as they don't have any resources, they were open to traffickers to just recruit them, and offer them those kind of jobs to make money. And that's where they took advantage of a lot of people, just traffickers, because it just became worse of the situation that they were living before. And of course, because during the pandemic, if it was difficult to identify potential victims of human trafficking, with the pandemic, it just increased it. So I think the financial institution, on the way that they can actually help to decrease the vulnerability of the communities, is just to help those populations that are underserved populations, and that could be like creating those micro business loan or personal loan, or actually give them make for them easier to access to, like credit cards or open checking accounts. But the thing is, like, because you're unemployed, you are far away from the from being inclusive, and you get just being far away from that, and you're being disqualified to get those kind of financial help. And that's what I believe it has increased the chances for trafficking to actually start trafficking more. Thank you.
Diona, can I go ahead? Yeah, so I just wanted to add, I certainly agree with what both Isabella and Ronnie said. And just to add additionally, that I think that the impact of the pandemic may even be worse in another way, in that we've seen a move towards digital financial inclusion, which works where you have sophisticated populations, people who are financially and otherwise literate, etc. But on the other side of that, it further excludes the persons who are poor, who are refugees, who are elderly, and those who are barely illiterate, because it becomes more complicated now. You need access to some sort of electronic device in order to do this. And so while we go full steam ahead in terms of digital financial inclusion, I think that financial institutions have to find a balance where they still look at the regular, over-the-counter means, where they still have cash in the society, although we've been taught in terms of countering money laundering, terrorist financing, cash is bad. For COVID, people are afraid to use cash because they figure it's transmitting the virus, etc. But we have to make sure that there's a balance so that we don't lose further persons to being excluded simply because now they can't meet what in some instances seems to be a higher level of requirements to be digitally included. So I think that's an important aspect too. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. Carlos, would you like to add?
Yes, I just want to add that, I mean, from UNODC, we also want to contribute with some evidence that we have collected through our work. As I mentioned before, we are producing the global report, and also during 2020 and 2021, we conducted a study around the effects of the COVID pandemic on trafficking in person. And in this report, it was concluded that since the start of the COVID pandemic, trafficking in person went even further underground, making estimates of the scale of trafficking in persons more difficult. And specifically in Latin America and the Caribbean, this report also highlighted that migrants have been affected by the pandemic in a number of ways. Many have lost their employment in the destination country, for example, and have been unable to return to their homes. Some of them ended up in an irregular status in destination countries after being unable to renew their residence or work permits. And also there were some challenges for civil society organizations. For example, some of the interviewing organizations showed that they have to move all their services online. And it was also a challenge for them to transform their practices and also to shift their budgets and start to procure some elements to conduct these services in an online way. So it's evident that the COVID pandemic had a big impact. Also, the global report on trafficking in persons collected 233 cases. And in all of these cases was evident that before victims are required, they showed that the majority of the victims were in a condition of economic need, which is also a very good point to highlight here.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, everyone, actually, because you've touched on really important issues that need to be considered. And I guess, Ronnie, you almost anticipated my last question, really, which was around, what sort of financial interventions and services can be initiated that are appropriate and respond appropriately to the needs. As Dawn mentioned, there needs to be a balance between the movement, as much as it was useful during the COVID pandemic, the movement towards digital financial inclusion can also leave some people behind or actually make them even further excluded. So just to open that up to the panel, I mean, what do you think that the financial sector can do here, in addition to considering those aspects?
Perhaps I could start. Yes, I think it really is about making it as simple as possible for financial institutions to offer simplified accounts that, as Dawn said, are not overly reliant on technology, or in the case of vulnerable people and displaced people, on very formal or specific forms of identity. We have to empower financial institutions to use simplified measures, and to do that, personally, I think it has to come from the top. I think it needs to come from the Financial Action Task Force and governments who can work with national financial supervisors as well as financial institutions to give people the confidence to use a risk-based approach to establish simplified and basic bank accounts that serve populations, but also mitigate their financial crime risks. There always will be a risk that we need to be cognizant of. But as you say, we really can't leave people behind. It can't be too overly reliant on technology. And this can all be done. No laws need to be changed. The standards that exist can facilitate this, but it's about a lack of confidence in financial institutions. So I think, personally, stopping human trafficking is quite a strong rallying cry to bring us all together and work on this issue. And I think after the pandemic, it would be great if we took a moment to really reevaluate what we have in place and see how we could build these accounts for these populations who need them most. I think it's very possible to do.
Thanks, Isabella. I think that also the Financial Action Task Force report on unintended consequences, particularly of de-risking, provides a really great opportunity, in fact, for some reflection within the sector to think about those very issues around simplifying the processes, making it easier for survivors and vulnerable populations to open accounts. Dawn, did you want to add?
I just wanted to fully agree with Isabella in terms of that. That too was my main thing that I think would really make a big difference and impact in terms of helping with unbanked persons, and therefore by extension with the whole risk for human trafficking. I also think hand in hand, of course, is to go with increased in financial literacy. So providing vulnerable populations with different types of financial products and services, the information about it, how they can access it. Because especially sometimes I've been in fora where you have victims and they feel victimized all over to even come forward and to ask for basic services that actually they should have. They feel they'd be rejected. They don't want people to know what has happened to them. They don't have documentation. And so I think that the financial institutions, in addition to what Isabella said, which I fully agree with, should have a role in terms of financial literacy and helping these people to come forward. Daniel earlier on talked about 1.7 billion people being unbanked. I mean, that's a market to tap right there if bankers want to look at it from an economic perspective. So even though they may be persons who are not, financially significant to a bank, together 1.7 billion people or new customers is a lot. So I think that would go hand in hand in terms of having products, but also sharing ways in which they can, vulnerable persons can access them. Thank you.
Thanks, Dawn. I'll just remind the participants as well, if you do have any questions that you'd like us to address in the question and answer session, please do put them in the chat. We can come back to them. Would anybody else on the panel like to respond to this particular? Ronnie?
Yes. And it's something that we are claiming to for the financial institution to be more flexible. And as Dan and Isabella mentioned, just to make it easier for the underserved population to actually apply for any help that they can get from the financial institution. But I know too, and we have to be aware of that it's the high risk they have, because what even organized organizations, organized institutes, entities, they are utilizing bank to actually money laundering. So, and to make the process easier and no, easier for everybody, it also opens a door for, their financial institution money to be at risk that they're gonna lose the money as well. And we get that part. But in the survival sector, we believe like if we can get that kind of help, and I know few survivors that they already been getting business loans from different banks, and they have opening their own business, and they actually have generated jobs for other survivors and other underserved population. So I think like supporting that idea, it's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Ronnie. Carlos, did you want to contribute here?
Yes, basically, I mean, from UNODC, we really believe that the use of technology is key to close the gap between the risk of trafficking and the role of the financial institutions here. I will say that, I mean, initiatives that are focused on a specific group, for example, in Latin America and the Caribbean, there is a big potential and also a big risk on victims of trafficking for domestic servitude, which could be like a very interesting pilot group to apply like a model of prevention. And also back to the point of technology, how we can connect better law enforcement agency, prosecutors, and the financial sector, which I think it's a key point for UNODC mandate, and also like a way forward to combat trafficking in the region.
Thank you, Carlos. If it's okay with the panel, I'm going to move to the questions that the participants have raised. So I'll start with a question from Andrea da Silva. She asks, how can financial inclusion be part of addressing the root causes of trafficking? For example, are you considering to expand the financial inclusion program to include those who are most vulnerable to trafficking, i.e. women and girls? Would anyone like to take that question on? I think that specifically thinking about the root causes of trafficking, we've talked about poverty, we've talked about inequality and discrimination within society. In what ways can financial inclusion initiatives really address those? Would anyone like to take that?
Maybe, Yona, I can just quickly jump in because it speaks specifically of our inclusion program also.
Yes,
so,
please.
Look, I believe it will be beyond our capacities to roll out a global inclusion program and access to bank account program. However, I think with the existing survivor inclusion program, we believe that there's a learning process happening in banks to learn how to provide financial services to these populations, and that will have in itself a positive impact of being more open and having a trend addressing the current and former de-risking trend. So a kind of a counter narrative to that. I think that will be from a fast perspective of what we can do, and then of course we work very jointly with other organizations who are active in that regard too. Clearly, for me, the key is with the global standard setters, and it's good work being done by RUSI here, also to inform their work on de-risking, and it's a great achievement that the FATF has already recognized that there are unintended consequences, and they are willing to address them. I hope this will flow into the way how countries are going to be assessed in the next cycle, and countries that contribute to financial exclusion would get criticized by these standard bodies, because inherently you would also increase money laundering risks with that practice.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you. And I think just picking up on some of the discussion earlier as well, to think about the gendered nature of trafficking and slavery within the region. You know, there's the opportunity to think about some of the things that the panelists have spoken about, whether that's financial literacy or financial education, but targeted work within communities that help women and girls in particular to empower themselves economically is perhaps one of the ways forward to address that. I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Helen Taylor from the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. Now, Helen says that they're working on piloting some financial inclusion products, and she'd be interested to find out what the panelists have seen as the most promising or successful products for survivor or highly vulnerable populations. Would anyone like to answer that one? Ronnie.
The only thing that I have seen so far, and is some of the NGOs working with banks. They are like the filter, or like the the filter between the survivor and the bank. So they've been helping survivor to get those micro loan. That's one of the services, the product that they have. Also credit cards or a line of credit, and those three things been helpful. You know, it's not a lot of money, but at least you can start with $1,000, and that's what I've seen so far. That survivor have been utilizing from those products they have created, especially just for survival. But the banks, they did that because of the NGOs. NGO have all the information, and they like trust the NGO with all the data they have from the survivors. So it's easier.
Thanks, Ronnie. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question from Kazan Sami. There needs to be an understanding globally that persons may be unbanked, partly due to the higher recurrent banking fees and requirement for new accounts, for example, 2 forms of identification or utility bills, especially for survivors who do not have these documents to meet the requirements. How much of the work being done by the UN includes advocating to banks and credit union industry to make formal banking more accessible? I think that I can probably answer that question from FAST's perspective, in that we're working really closely with a consortium of banks, as well as survivor support organisations, to address this issue in particular. So we know that it can be done. And I think it was Isabella who mentioned this before. This is possible. It's not an impossible thing to happen. I think that what we're keen to do is ensure that, you know, we've set the precedent. We know the proof of concept. This can be done. Bank accounts can be opened without these barriers, particularly in the UK, US, and Canada. But we want to take that learning and disseminate that across other countries and regions of the world. I'm going to move quickly on to the next question. I can see that the time is running away from us. Isabella, did you want to quickly add something to that?
Just so quickly, sorry. Just to say that, yeah, just to the work, the excellent work that you guys do. I mean, so many of the issues with account opening stemmed from myths that exist and have existed for the past 30 years, but aren't really found in standards or anything like that. And I think it's about changing the culture at banks to ensure that they can be more inclusive. But you have to remember, these are huge organizations with policies and procedures that take months, if not years, to change. And so it is a slow moving beast. But as you say, it is possible, and it's just about changing a myth and being able to action more accounts.
Thanks, Isabella. I'm going to move on to the very last question, which I think, reading it, is more of a statement than a question, from Rosalie Keach, calling on the UN to expand its policies and procedures to bankrupt the business of human trafficking and to enable collaboration multilaterally and multi-sectorally. Calling on the member states and United Nations to conduct a multi-sectoral summit in 2022 to identify measurable commitments in bankrupting the business of human trafficking. Like I say, that I think is a statement rather than a question. So I would just like to wrap up here, because we have 1 minute left, just to thank everybody, particularly our fantastic panelists for fielding these questions. But also to thank our sponsor, Mission Liechtenstein, and the co-sponsors of the event, Australia, Spain, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. Our panelists, our participants, you have all contributed to a fantastic conversation here that we need to continue. It's clear that the needs of victims, survivors, and those populations who are most vulnerable to experiencing human trafficking and slavery need to be at the foremost of the financial sector's decisions around financial inclusion, and that we can address these in a multitude of ways. So rather than an either-or approach to digital financial inclusion, for example, we need a both-and. We need digital financial inclusion, and we also need face-to-face banking, and we also need to be addressing particularly the needs of cash-based and rural communities who are increasingly vulnerable, as we've seen throughout the pandemic. So I'm going to wrap up there and just thank everyone again. And yes, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.